At just 14, Lysander was sold to the highest bidder in Athens' shadowy slave markets. What happened next would break every rule of Greek society and ultimately destroy the boy who dared to love his master. Picture ancient Athens. 420 BC, marble columns gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. Philosophers debated freedom while children were bought and sold like pottery. Behind those beautiful facades lurked a darker truth, one that would consume a nobleman's son who lost everything in a single night. This is the story of forbidden love, impossible choices, and a society that destroyed what it couldn't understand. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about the birthplace of Western civilization. Lysander's world shattered on a Tuesday morning in spring. The son of a wealthy merchant family, he'd grown up in luxury most Athenians could only dream of. Marble floors beneath his feet, silk tunics against his skin. Private tutors teach him poetry, mathematics, and philosophy. At 13, he was already fluent in 3 languages and could recite Homer from memory. His father, Mnestheus, owned a fleet of trading ships. Their house overlooked the harbor, where Lysander would spend hours watching vessels return from distant lands, loaded with spices, silver, and stories from across the Mediterranean. He dreamed of adventure, of seeing the world beyond Athens' walls. But the gods, it seemed, had different plans. When pirates seized 3 of his father's ships near Crete, the family's fortune vanished overnight. Debts that had seemed manageable suddenly became crushing. Creditors circled like vultures. Within weeks, the marble floors were sold. The silk tunics disappeared. Even the household slaves were auctioned off to pay what they owed. Lysander watched his childhood crumble piece by piece, but nothing could have prepared him for his father's final, desperate decision. "Forgive me, my son," Mnestheus whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "There's no other way." The next morning, Lysander found himself standing naked in Athens' slave market, while strange men examined him like livestock. But who was buying him? And what did they want with a nobleman's son? The man who purchased Lysander wasn't what you'd expect. Critias was in his 50s, cultured and refined, a wealthy aristocrat with connections to Athens' most powerful families. He dressed simply but expensively, spoke softly but commanded respect. To outsiders he seemed almost kind. "You'll learn to call me master," Critias said as they walked through his estate, "but I prefer to think of our relationship as educational." The house was magnificent. Gardens filled with olive trees and flowering vines, rooms lined with scrolls and artwork from across the known world. For a moment, Lysander dared to hope. Maybe this wouldn't be so terrible. Maybe he'd simply become a servant or scribe. He couldn't have been more wrong. The training began that very night. Lessons that had nothing to do with reading or writing. Instructions that made his stomach turn and his face burn with shame. Other boys were there too, some his age, others younger, all with the same hollow look in their eyes. The look of children who'd learned to survive by becoming something else entirely. "Resistance is pointless," whispered Marcus, a Roman boy, who'd been there for 2 years. "Fight back, and the punishments get worse. Much worse." Days blended into weeks. Lysander learned to walk differently, speak differently, smile on command. He discovered muscles he didn't know he had, and ways they could be made to ache. He memorized the preferences of men whose names. He was forbidden to speak aloud, but as the weeks passed, something unexpected began to happen. Something that would change everything. His master was watching him, really watching him, and in Critias's eyes, Lysander glimpsed something no slave was ever supposed to see. It started with poetry. 3 months into his captivity, Lysander was summoned to Critias's private study. Instead of the usual duties, his master handed him a scroll. "Read this," Critias commanded. The poem was about longing, about love that dare not speak its name. As Lysander read aloud, his voice trembling slightly, he noticed something strange. Critias wasn't looking at the scroll. He was looking at him. "You understand it," Critias said quietly. "The meaning behind the words." Lysander nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Most people see only what's written on the surface. But you see deeper. Night after night, these sessions continued. Poetry led to philosophy. Philosophy in personal conversations. Critias began asking about Lysander's dreams, his fears, his thoughts on everything from politics to the nature of the gods. For the first time in months, Lysander felt almost human again. But it was dangerous territory they were entering. In Athens, relationships between men weren't uncommon, but they followed strict rules. The older partner, the Erastes, was expected to mentor and guide. The younger, the Eromenos, was supposed to be passive, temporary. What was growing between Critias and Lysander was something else entirely. Something that violated every social boundary their world understood. "I know what you're thinking," Critias said one evening as they sat in his garden, watching the sunset.
"Paint the sky crimson. That this is wrong. That I am your master and you're my property." Lysander remained silent, but his heart was pounding. But what if we could forget about master and slave just for a moment? What if we were simply two people who... "My lord," Lysander interrupted, his voice barely a whisper.
"You're asking me to feel something I'm not supposed to feel?" Critias reached out, almost touching Lysander's face before stopping himself. "I'm not asking you to feel anything. I'm asking if you already do." The question hung in the air between them like a knife waiting to fall, because they both knew the answer. And they both knew it would destroy them. Love, it turned out, was impossible to hide. Despite their best efforts to maintain the facade of master and slave, people began to notice. The way Critias looked at Lysander during dinner parties. The boy was dressed in finer clothes than the
other slaves. The fact that he was never sent to serve other men, never loaned out or rented like property. The whispers started small.
Servants gossiping in kitchens, neighbors exchanged knowing looks. But in Athens, whispers had a way of reaching the wrong ears, especially when those ears belonged to Critias's nephew, Alexis. Alexis was 25, ambitious, and desperately in need of his uncle's inheritance. He'd always assumed the old man would die childless, leaving everything to him. But lately Critias had been talking about freeing certain slaves, about rewriting his will. "You're making a fool of yourself, uncle," Alexis said, during what should have been a private family dinner. "The whole city is talking," Critias's jaw tightened. "Talking about what? About how you've forgotten your place. And his." Alexis gestured dismissively at Lysander, who was serving wine with shaking hands. "A slave is a slave, no matter how prettily you dress him up." That night, Lysander and Critias met in secret in the garden. The older man was pacing, agitated in a way Lysander had never seen. "He's right, you know," Critias said finally. "About the talking. about the danger we're in." "Then we stop," Lysander replied, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "We go back to the way things were, can we?" Critias turned to face him, moonlight catching the tears in his eyes. "Can you look at me and see only your master? Can I touch you and feel only ownership?" The answer was no. They both knew it, but their love had been noticed by more than just family. The authorities were asking questions. Neighbors were filing complaints, and in Athens there were laws about masters who became too attached to their property. Laws with penalties neither of them was prepared to face. As they held each other in the shadows of the olive trees, neither realized they were being watched, that tomorrow would bring consequences that would shatter both their worlds forever. The trial lasted 3 days. Alexis had done his work well. Witnesses lined up to testify about the unnatural relationship between Critias and his slave. Neighbors described scenes that, even twisted by gossip and spite, painted a clear picture of a master who had forgotten his place. But the real blow came when they called Lysander to testify. Standing before the court, chained and dressed in simple slave clothes, he faced an impossible choice: tell the truth and destroy the man he loved, or lie and watch himself be sold to someone far worse than Critias had ever been. "Speak, boy," commanded the lead magistrate. "Did your master treat you as property, as the law requires? Or did he treat you as something else?" Lysander's eyes found Critias in the crowd. The older man gave the slightest shake of his head. "Don't sacrifice yourself for me," his expression seemed to say. "Save what you can." "He treated me." Lysander's voice cracked. "He treated me as a slave, my lords. Nothing more. It was the right answer, the legal answer, the answer that might spare them both the worst punishments. But saying it felt like tearing out his own heart. The court found Critias guilty of corrupting his household and failing in his duties as a master. His punishment was severe but not fatal. He lost half his property and was banned from owning male slaves under 25. Lysander was sold immediately to a brothel owner from the port district. They never saw each other again, but the story doesn't end there. 6 months later, Critias was found dead in his garden, a cup of hemlock beside him. His final letter spoke of a love that Athens could never understand, and a boy whose courage had shamed them all. As for Lysander, well, that's a story the records don't tell. Some say he died young in the brothels. Others claim he escaped to Egypt, where different rules applied. But in the poetry that survives from that era, we find verses about a love that refused to die, even when the world demanded it should. Perhaps that's all the ending we need. Stories like Lysander's remind us that behind every historical era were real people with real hearts facing impossible choices in worlds that often refused to understand them. If these forgotten voices moved you, hit that subscribe button to uncover more hidden truths from the ancient world. What other untold stories do you think deserve to be remembered? Share your thoughts in the comments below.